Hey, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Steve Clemens, editor-at-large of The Hill. We're delighted to have you joining us for the Future of Human Connectivity, our summit in 3 parts. Before we get underway, a message from our chairman of The Hill, Jimmy Finkelstein.
Good morning. I'm Jimmy Finkelstein, chairman of The Hill, and I want to welcome you to the Future of Human Connectivity. I want to thank the audience for attending today. I want to thank our fantastic faculty for being with us and spending the day with us, and Steve Clemens will be moderating all day. Thank you, Steve. A special thanks to Chairman Pai of the FCC. The chairman has such a wonderful background and so interesting. He went to Harvard, he went to the University of Chicago Law School, clerked for a federal court. He worked at Jenner and Block. He worked as a counsel in the Senate. He worked as a general counsel to one of our great companies in the United States. Worked in various different offices at the FCC, and of course now he's chairman of the FCC. He has such a great background and has such a important role in what we see and what we hear. Probably the most important person in America in this area. What happens in terms of 5G, what happens in the First Amendment, what happens in broadband, net neutrality, I could go on and on and on. He's just in a critical place at a critical time in terms of human connectivity. So it's an honor, Chairman Pai, to have you. And at this point, I'm going to turn over the program to Bob Cusack, our great editor of The Hill, and I will leave you, Bob, to interview the chairman. Have a nice day. Enjoy the day.
Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you, Steve. And thank you, Chairman Pai, for joining us. I did want to start with a COVID question. In the CARES Act, Mr. Chairman, there was $200 million in telehealth, and FCC has taken the lead on this. That money has been exhausted. Should Congress replenish this fund?
Question. I'd be remiss though if I didn't say thank you for hosting this conversation. Thanks to Mr. Finkelstein for the very kind introduction, and thanks to Steve Clemens, of course, for moderating over the entire panel. Telehealth, I think, has had its moment to shine in the middle of this dismal pandemic. And one of the things we pitched Congress early on was this telehealth program, which they gave us authority to do in the CARES Act. I think thus far, at least, the program has been very, very successful. The 539 applications we granted have already started, some of them submitting stories about how they're using this funding to extend their healthcare expertise, improve access and outcomes. And if Congress sees fit to increase the funding through that program or through a similar program, we would certainly duly administer it. And we're working with Congress on some of those discussions right now. But it's too early to say, I think, whether and to what extent they will extend funding for a further round.
Mr. Chairman, schools are starting up, and of course, many are going remote learning. You've asked Congress for more funding and authority on this issue. Are you hopeful that this is going to be in the next package? And why do you need this authority? Was it not included in prior packages?
So we did ask Congress in the earlier round of negotiations that led to the CARES Act to consider the creation of a remote learning initiative that was a streamlined program, somewhat similar to what they did give us authority to do in telehealth, because we wanted to have a more targeted solution that was outside of the bureaucratic rules and processes that attended our E-rate program, which is an important program. But given the nature of the emergency, we need to distribute funding more quickly and in a more flexible way. Also, the statute that we administer, the E-rate statute, limits our ability to support these services to classrooms. It uses that term, classrooms. And so we wanted to make sure we worked with Congress proactively, and we've done that since early March. So I hope that we are able to continue to work with Congress and those members of Congress who are interested in remote learning solutions. Obviously, with the school year coming up and with many schools going virtual, this is a more important issue than ever.
Earlier this year, FCC fined Sinclair a record amount. On a separate issue recently, Sinclair was going to broadcast a program that had a conspiracy theory about Anthony Fauci and COVID-19. Sinclair decided not to run that. Was that the right decision, and would have the FCC gotten involved in this kind of issue?
I can't say, of course, whether the FCC would have gotten involved. And traditionally, of course, the FCC doesn't weigh in on editorial judgments made by broadcast companies about the content of newscasts. So unfortunately, I can't weigh in on that particular issue, just as I haven't weighed in on issues similar to that over the past 3.5 years since I've become chairman. So unfortunately, I can't give you much insight on that.
In June, there were 4 Republican senators who wrote to you, and they basically want you to redefine so-called Section 230. The White House has also issued a presidential executive order on this, highlighting social media bias. Is there a bias, and if so, what, if anything, is FCC going to do about it?
Well, in terms of what we're going to do about it, we just recently received the petition from the NTIA, a part of the Department of Commerce, that submitted a petition for rulemaking. And so we will carefully review that petition in the days to come. But what I will say is, back in November of 2017, I gave a speech in which I highlighted the fact that transparency, I think, is very important when it comes to social media platforms, how these companies are making decisions about what we see and what we don't, for instance. And I think that is one of the issues that is animating both sides of Congress now and both houses of Congress to think about some of these issues. In fact, just shortly, you'll see, among other things, this issue being discussed, I anticipate, at a hearing that's going to be held before the House Judiciary Committee. And so it's interesting that elected lawmakers now, too, have focused on this as an issue.
Yeah, that was my next question, actually, about that hearing. Obviously, a lot of tech CEOs, it's going to be a big story of the day. There has been pressure on social media companies, whether it's Facebook or Twitter, and Twitter just recently, they have started to correct the president's tweets and also kind of put Donald Trump Jr. on the sideline. I know you're a big defender of the First Amendment. Do you think this is a good idea, or is this a slippery slope?
Well, again, this is one of the issues that may be intertwined in the petition for rulemaking, so I can't comment on any particular controversy. But what I will say is what I've said for a couple of years, is that transparency in these social media platforms is important. It's important for consumers to understand exactly how the platforms are making some of these decisions. And some would argue that there isn't such transparency now. And I think that's part of the reason why this is one of the strands that we would anticipate hearing in the deliberations today, and that we've heard from members of Congress on both sides of the aisle over the past couple of months and years.
It's been a couple years since FCC repealed the net neutrality Obama-era rules. What has been the impact of that? And I know that you're working with FTC on this, but Joe Biden has said if he's elected, he would restore them. What would be the impact of that as well?
Well, certainly I can't predict what any future FCC would do. We are an independent agency, and so obviously a future independent agency would have to make an independent judgment about the way forward. But overall, I think the decision has been very much positive. If you look at ever since December 14th of 2017, when we voted, the average fixed broadband speeds in the United States are up 87%, according to Ookla, which is an independent third party that assesses broadband speeds in the United States. Infrastructure investment in the aggregate has gone up. Millions more Americans have access to the internet than before. The online experience is free and open, as we can see across these different platforms in terms of the transmission of data. And moreover, what is very interesting is the comparison with Europe, which does have these utility-style, heavy-handed net neutrality regulations. Not only have they seen less infrastructure investment as a result, but at the onset of the pandemic, the European Commission had to go hand in hand to YouTube and Netflix and all these other streaming companies and ask them to proactively throttle video content to consumers. So consumers are now getting a worse video product over the internet than they did before. And so I would argue our light touch market-based regulation has been entirely the right one. And it's proven some of these hysterical predictions that we saw 2.5 years ago about having to pay $5 per tweet or getting the internet one word at a time or the internet not even existing anymore. It's put all those hysterical predictions to bed.
Have you seen any anti-competitive behavior? Because those were some of the predictions that companies would try to game the system, and you've deferred to FTC on that. Has there been enforcement in this area since the rules were adopted?
So as you pointed out earlier, we do have a memorandum of understanding with the Federal Trade Commission, so we work with them. And so any allegation that we receive of any competitive conduct or conduct that otherwise might violate Section 5 of the FTC Act, we, of course, would share that with them. And I think one of the things that's instructive is during the deliberations up to net neutrality, the 2017 decision, and even thereafter, all of these allegations are always said, well, if this happens or should this happen. And that's entirely the point. Unless there's a demonstrated market failure, preemptive regulation of all 4,400 and some internet service providers of the FCC is inappropriate. The way to handle instances of anti-competitive conduct is to look at the particular company that is allegedly engaging in that conduct and use targeted antitrust or consumer protection laws to address it. It's not to have a blanket rule of utility-style regulation at the FCC. And so I think just the very existence of the question hints at the fact that we made the right determination in terms of our light touch framework. Oh, I would also add, by the way, the transparency rule we adopted at the FCC is very, very powerful because all of these internet service providers have to disclose publicly their business practices, network management practices, et cetera. So we have front-end enforcement at the FCC, backed up by the FTC and the Department of Justice potentially for antitrust or other anti-competitive conduct.
Earlier this year, Mr. Chairman, some House Democrats called on FCC to act on Russian propaganda on U.S. radio stations, citing Russian interference in the 2016 election. Yesterday, Attorney General Barr indicated, yes, Russia did interfere in the 2016 election, and they're probably interfering or trying to in the 2020 election. What is FCC doing on this interference?
So as I responded to those representatives who wrote to us, we will always administer the laws and regulations of the FCC faithfully. And so if there's a particular allegation or concern that they have, we want to make sure we're apprised of it so that we can take appropriate action on it. And so here too, as with all of these cases, we are going to take a look at the facts, apply the law fairly and dispassionately, and make the appropriate decision in the public interest.
One of the big issues that I think got lost in the COVID area is that there's been a suicide hotline, and that's especially important, well, before COVID-19, but especially since COVID-19. And it would set up 988 as a quick phone line. This is going to take a little time to implement. How many lives do you think this will save with a 3-digit phone line?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, it's hard to portend a particular number, but I think it's going to be in the thousands. If you look at the number of people who call today, it's something like 2 million people per year. We anticipate that many more will call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline through 988 after it's implemented fully by July 16th of 2022. There are millions more who are, of course, struggling with issues of suicidal ideation or mental health illness. And our goal is to make sure that when they are struggling, when they're in a moment of crisis, they won't have to think about that 10-digit number, which is important, but it's sometimes hard to remember. Instead, 988 will be embedded in their consciousness, in all of our consciousness, just as 911 is for emergencies. And I think the ease of that number, getting access to trained counselors who can help, is going to save tremendous numbers of lives. I've seen it, for example, in a visit to the Toledo Mental Health Center that I did earlier this year, where some of those counselors told me that they are able to intervene successfully in 95% of the cases for people who call or who come in. That's a tremendous success rate. And I think it shows the fact that when people are struggling, when they feel alone, especially during the pandemic, when social isolation, unfortunately, is the norm for many people, all it takes is a point of human contact who lets them know that they are loved, there's someone out there who can help, and that there's a better way forward. And that can make all the difference. So I'm really excited. And I think that this decision is going to herald a tremendous number of lives saved in the years to come.
Robocalls, it's the number one consumer complaint at the FCC. I know you're very familiar with this. Congress has passed laws on this. A lot of people have disconnected from their landline, but we still all get robocalls. What's the status of implementation, and when are these robocalls going to stop or at least be curtailed?
So we have seen a downtick during the pandemic of something like 30 to 40% of the robocalls. But even without that, the FCC has been pulling out the stops to attack this top consumer protection priority. We, for example, have mandated that phone companies adopt a new caller ID authentication framework that essentially legitimates every single phone number and lets callers know, or lets the recipients of calls know that the person calling is legitimately assigned that phone number. We've also empowered phone companies and encouraged them to block robocalls by default. We've also set up a reassigned numbers database so that people who get a phone call that's meant for somebody else, that they won't get those phone calls in the future. We've also made clear through a variety of different rulings that we expect gateway providers, these are the first points of contact in the United States for these foreign robocalls, to cut off these robocalls immediately. This is a joint effort with the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice. And over the past couple of months, we've actually gotten tremendous success where we sent letters to these gateway providers. We tell them, look, cut off the robocalls or you risk being cut off from the US network. And within 24 hours, they end those robocalls. So we've really amped up our efforts, and I know that those robocalls remain a concern for consumers. They are for me personally as a consumer myself, but we are taking aggressive action to make sure that this scourge of civilization, as former Senator Fritz Hollings once called it, becomes something we read about in the history books.
FCC has found Huawei and ZTE have ties to the Chinese Communist Party. They obviously disagree with that. How confident are you in that finding, and what does that finding mean in this 5G world? And do you also consult with the State Department and other departments about these issues?
Yeah, tackling the last question first, absolutely. We have had a joint effort across government, the State Department, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, White House National Security Council, and others who have equities in this issue. And part of the reason is that, of course, 5G and related communication security issues cut across all of these different agencies and all of the different industries and aspects of our society. And especially when you're talking about 5G, which will underlie everything from transportation to healthcare, agriculture to manufacturing, it's important that we get it right at the outset so that we're not left a few years from now trying to retrofit security solutions onto an already built network. And so at the FCC, at least, we've worked very diligently to make sure that any universal service funds, that is the federal subsidies that we oversee, are not spent on problematic equipment. And based on consultation with the intelligence community and the national security agencies, we determined that Huawei and ZTE did present such a threat, such a problem. And additionally, I personally have been involved in working with some of our foreign counterparts everywhere from the United Kingdom to India to Brazil to Israel to make sure that we have a shared understanding about a risk-based framework for what equipment and services go into these networks. And that international effort is extremely important because, of course, when you're talking about a 5G network being built at a global scale, if the United States goes in one direction, we want to make sure that as many countries as possible also go in that same direction.
You know, I talked to a lot of people in the so-called Acela corridor, and where the internet is very strong. But in rural areas, the internet is not very strong. So can you talk about that, and specifically on the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund? What's the status of that and that auction? And now more than ever, is getting broadband to everywhere.
A critical issue. Our top issue has been closing the digital divide over the last 3.5 years. And that's something I take personally, having grown up in a small town of Parsons, Kansas, about 3 hours south of Kansas City. And it is we're keenly aware during the pandemic, of course, that broadband is more important than ever for telework, telehealth, distance learning, and the rest. And there are millions of Americans who don't have it. And so on October 29th, we're going to be starting the first phase of the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund that you mentioned. This is going to be a $16 billion program in the first phase, $4 billion in the second phase, to target up to 6 million homes and businesses that we know, based on whatever broadband map you consult, do not have access to broadband at the FCC's definition of 25 megabits per second. We're targeting unserved areas. We're encouraging competition from a variety of companies using a variety of technologies. And critically, we are instituting very strict accountability measures. The funding that they get, they have to use to build out broadband on a specified time frame. Otherwise, there are penalties for non-performance. And that's absolutely critical. It's one thing to, of course, start a program and get all the nice press releases out of it. What matters to me is getting those millions of Americans connected to the internet. It's more critical than ever. And this FCC is determined to do whatever we can to close that divide and deliver what I call digital opportunity to everybody, regardless of where they live.
There's pending legislation from Republican senators on the Digital Opportunity Fund, which would basically call for an accelerated deployment. Do you think that bill is a good idea?
So the bill that I'm thinking about, one of the concerns I have is that it would require us to change course in such a way that inadvertently it would require us to do some certain administrative processes and delay the auction, delay the distribution of the funding. And that's not something I think anybody wants to see. So we're always looking for creative solutions. If Congress sees fit to work with us on legislation along these lines, we really wanted to augment our efforts as opposed to inadvertently delay them. And so we've had extensive conversations with Republicans and Democrats who share our priority on this, and hopefully we'll be able to make our way forward on October 29th or sooner if there's a creative solution with this RDOF.
Chairman Pai, last question. How has COVID-19 affected your day-to-day life and also the day-to-day life of FCC employees? Where do you see them as far as working from home? It seems like it's going to go into 2021. Just kind of a day in the life of both yours and your employees of how you're getting through this time period.
Yeah, it's been a challenge. And as you can see from my background, this has been my home office for the past almost 5 months now. And we were one of the first agencies to move to stay-at-home, work-from-home protocols. And that was because, as I told the FCC staff, their health and safety is always going to be my top priority. They are the best asset that any federal agency could ever have. And I want to make sure that they know that we have their back in terms of making sure they're able to do their job safely. And so they've been incredibly productive, not just the bread and butter work of setting up things like the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund or the 5G spectrum auction we have going on right now, but also all of the COVID-related work, the telehealth program that we talked about, and a few other things that they've been going above and beyond. And so we are going to be working from home for the next several months, and we are anticipating at some point moving to our new building, which is across the street from NPR here in Washington, for folks who know that area. But the important thing to me is to make sure that if and when the FCC is able to move into that building, we're able to do so safely. And I just want to commend again all of the federal staff in Washington and across the country at the FCC who've done heroic work. People may never know their names or even the particular orders they've worked on, but they see the benefit at the end of the day with broadband and telehealth, ending some of these robocalls and so many other things that are critical to our daily lives. They are the unsung heroes of public service, in my view.
Chairman Pai, thank you for joining us this morning.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. Great to be with you.
And I'll hand it back to Steve.
Great to see you, Bob. I mean, I remember the last time we saw Chairman Pai. Do you remember where that was?
No, you didn't tell me.
Will on the Hill.
Oh, that's right.
We were dressed
right.
in
charity
Shakespearean outfits and raising money for the arts and children. And Chairman Pai was great that time. In any case, thank you, Bob and Chairman Pai, for those insightful thoughts about this world we're walking into. Prepared or not, COVID-19 has pushed us all into an ultra-connected world. But connectivity is not just about machines and sensors. People lie at the heart of this technology, which is designed to extend our dreams, enhance our quality of life, and transform our communication possibilities. Today, we're going to examine this leap in human connectivity and ask how we can leverage technology to generate the right kinds of upheaval, if there is a right kind of upheaval, to help create community and fix divides. In this hour, we will identify the many barriers we still need to overcome to ensure every American has access to this digital world. Hour 2 will be an exploration of smart cities, high on my list, 5G, and the tech infrastructure needed to make it all happen. In Hour 3, our final hour, we're going to look toward the future and find out what sci-fi dreams and innovators have conjured into the real world. We have the CEO of Virgin Hyperloop. One of the coolest things I want to do, I want to travel in a tube. We're going to hear a lot about that. We've assembled all the experts, policymakers, leading technologists, business and community leaders for a 360-degree look at human connectivity. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsors, Facebook, Nokia, and Qualcomm. Before we dive in, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at #TheHillConnects. We are broadcasting live and we'll be taking your questions throughout the program. And if you experience any trouble with the video refreshing the page, hopefully we'll fix the problem. Our next guest is Larry Irving, President and CEO of the Irving Group. Larry Irving was inducted into the Internet Hall of Fame for his work on the first empirical study proving the existence of the digital divide. He's a former administrator of the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, a former Assistant Secretary of Commerce. He's deep into this subject. Larry, thank you so much for joining us. Great to be with you. You and I have talked, I don't know, for decades about this subject. And so let me start. Why, when it comes to technology and making sure that we have an inclusive participation and engagement, why haven't we succeeded in erasing the digital divide, which you helped to articulate and show people existed?
Politics as much as anything else, and will. Steve, let me give you an example. 25 years ago, the first report came out that kind of identified that there was a digital divide in America. In that first report, I noted that there were five groups of people. If you were a minority, if you were poor, if you were elderly, if you were rural, if you were low income, you were less likely to be connected. If you look at what the Pew Internet Research, the Commerce Department, everybody who comes out with a report today, the five groups that are most likely to not be connected to the internet are minorities, the poor, the elderly, the less educated, and the rural. We've closed a lot of the divide, but in a country as rich as ours, to have literally 20 million urban and suburban households not connected to the internet is a disgrace. I just watched Chairman Pai, and he's a friend. I have great respect for him. But his definition of the digital divide is rural Americans, and there are 5 million American households, maybe 6 million American households, that simply physically can't get access to the internet. And we should and must do something to help those Americans get connected to the internet. But there are 20 million American households, almost 22 million American households that don't have access to the internet because of affordability. They can't pay the bill. And when you think about the reality that that was pre-pandemic, before people started losing paychecks, couldn't pay their mortgage, it is beyond disgraceful that the United States of America, which pioneered the internet, hasn't figured out a way to get every American who wants to be connected. And here's the other problem. 27% of senior citizens, at a time we're telling our senior citizens that they shouldn't have physical contact with people, 27% of Americans in this country, rural and urban, don't have access to the internet. How is that possible?
You and I have been to conferences around the world together, and we've been in places like Australia. You and I both know that South Korea has essentially 100% link up. We see India deploying broadband in ways that I think would make many here quite envious of the extensiveness of that. What countries do you think, what are they doing that we're not doing when you look at the broadband connections of some of the leaders globally compared to what the United States, the path the United States has followed?
There's no one size fits all. China's done a phenomenal job, but there's been some cost to privacy and other things in the way that China's doing it. I was talking to some folks yesterday. India has about half of their nation connected. They're going to try to connect another 200 million, which is about the size of our nation, or more than half the size of our nation in the next 2 to 3 years. The European Union has done some amazing things in some nations, but other nations are far behind. Each nation has to kind of look at where they are and figure it out. What we've done really well, we've spent a lot of money, we have a lot of competition, but there are market failures. And I think what other nations have done that we haven't done is they try to drive market approaches, but where the market's not working, they'll intercede and say, the market's not doing this, we need to have a government effort to help. And what's interesting in the United States, we have exactly that concept when it comes to rural America. But we have to have that kind of concept for all of America. To say that we're going to spend $20 billion to help 5 million households, but we're not going to have any government intervention to help 22 million households, somehow seems to be a little backwards to me. And again, I don't begrudge trying to do things for rural America. My family comes from rural America, North Carolina, South Carolina, before I was born, and I have family still there. But I certainly want to make sure that, when I listen to Chairman Pai talk about he's from Kansas and he wants to do things for folks in Kansas. I'm from Queens, New York. I went to a school called PS 118 Queens. Two facts I want to give you, Steve. 43% of the students at PS 118 Queens, which is a working class Black community, it's a quintessential community in New York City. 43% of those kids don't have broadband access at home, and a significant number of those kids don't have the tools they need if they had broadband access, a computer or a tablet that could give them remote access. 40% of small businesses in New York City, the richest city in the richest country in the history of the planet, don't have a gig network. Now, if you go to Manhattan, if you go to Williamsburg and Brooklyn, everybody has access to a gig network. But if you're trying to be a small businessman or woman in the Bronx or Queens or Latin Island, and you're Puerto Rican or Dominican or Black, the likelihood is that you don't have access to the same tools and technology that other folks have. That's a failure. And when we have those kinds of market failures, something should be done. And I'll be honest, we're in a political season. If there is one thing that I hope the Biden administration will look for as a moonshot, in 2008, for the Obama administration, I said that we needed 100 megabits per second to every home in America by 2012. That was I wrote this in a book. I sent this to the Obama administration as part of the transition. 12 years later, we're still not there.
Right.
The Biden administration has a chance to do something really, really meaningful by having a broadband moonshot. Say we're going to connect every household, every school, every library, every public institution in this country to a gig network, and we're going to do it with the next whatever the period of time is. And the example is when Bill Clinton and Al Gore said we're going to get every school, hospital, and library to the internet, and by 2020 we did it. And that kind of broad vision is what drove so much of the internet revolution we saw in the 1990s.
Right. Larry, just in a final question, sort of a closing question, take the tapestry that you just described, that school, you know, the number of people that are not online and connected, and the proposals that you've made in the past to leaders in this country, and add on to, and one of the reasons why the Hill wanted to do this event was to demystify and kind of explain what 5G meant, to kind of look at what's coming, which in part means Internet of Things, a connectivity connecting not only a lot of gadgets, but all of us to those gadgets. You know, artificial intelligence, and a kind of whole new strategic leap in technology and all of this. What does that next new world that's just coming roaring at us very quickly do? Is that an opportunity to fix some of the problems that you've defined, or is it just exacerbate all of the underlying conditions?
We have a choice. I was on a couple of conference calls. We have a choice. The internet is probably the most transformative technology of our lifetimes. I mean, look at what we're doing right here. Think of the way we all use the internet for entertainment, for commerce, for healthcare. One of the former FCC commissioners, I don't think he'll have a problem me saying this, had COVID. A former FCC commissioner had COVID. And one of the things that saved his life was he was on a conference call like this with his doctor doing a teleconference. And the doctor looked at him and said, I think you need to get to a hospital. That former FCC commissioner was very sick. If he hadn't had this kind of connectivity, he would not have he would have had a much worse health outcome. God, we want them all to live, but think about the millions of Americans who can't access their doctor because of that. This is transformative, but it can also exacerbate inequalities.
China, about Huawei, about telecommunications infrastructure. I haven't seen them put better ideas on the table. Richard Haas wrote in the Washington Post this week that we haven't seen the partnership with Europe on basically putting, you know, other partnerships on the table to deal with that. Piece. Are we letting them off the hook? Are we letting the administration off the hook by not saying, okay, we get your China concerns, we get their national security issues, where's your plan? Right.
Well, that was Richard's, I think, best point in that, in very good piece, was, okay, yeah, you're going after China, and various administrations always go after China. But they have been aggressive in recent years in the number South China Sea. But you're not working with your allies. If you're not working with your allies, then how do you put pressure on China when you're saying we're going to take troops out of South Korea?
Well, Bob Cusack, I don't know if we really need the other people out there when we have each other. But thank you for hanging out and chatting with us. Let's get back to work here. For months now, school systems across the country have tried and failed to find ways to safely reopen in the fall. As the pandemic rages, public schools are now finding themselves in the middle of a political battle. My next two guests represent teachers, and they represent parents. Lily Garcia is the president of the National Education Association, a professional association of 3 million educators. It is huge. Leslie Boggs is the president of the National Parent Teacher Association. We can solve all the problems right now between the two of you. The nation's oldest and largest volunteer child advocacy association. We're so glad to have you both here. Let me just start out, because I think when we've been talking about human connectivity, and the reason we wanted that word human in is because you can talk about connectivity that's coming. You can talk about connectivity of things and buildings and roads and streetlights and cars and our phones. But somehow people got lost. So I want to talk to you both and just ask you, what are the equities we have to go get right when we think about not just education, but putting people back in this mix? Let me start with Lily.
I appreciate it, and I'll intimidate your listeners by saying that I have a master's degree in instructional technology, which I got in 1983 on an Atari 800. So I want people to tremble a little bit. But what I did in that master's degree was to say, how do you use technology as a writing tool, as an editing tool, as a way to share what your what students were writing and get feedback and from their little playmates there in my class. And so it's always been the human part of technology. If you're teaching, you know that the computer in front of you, the iPad in front of you, is no different than a textbook, and it's really efficient, and maybe you can do some great research on it. But it's, what does that mean to the student in being able to synthesize, analyze, and create something new? And so we get excited about technology. This pandemic, however, is something completely different. We've always known that depending on what zip code you live in, some students have everything in the world in their schools, in their libraries, the technology, the connection that they have, the Wi-Fi, the broadband, everything that they need. And you can walk across the street to another school on the wrong side of the tracks, and they don't have any of that. And so we've been fighting for many, many years to get equity in access and opportunity in technology. Now the pandemic hits, and we're in an even more frightening situation, because we realize that when we had to turn so quickly to keep those kids safe and to keep the educators safe and to keep all of our families from being infected and infecting the community, we had to go to virtual learning. And it wasn't just what was in your school, it was what you had access to in your home. And the digital divide, if you are on the wrong side of that digital divide, it puts you at a distinct disadvantage. And in some cases, we lost kids. They didn't have, the only technology they had in their home was their mom's cell phone. And she took it to work with her because she was stocking shelves in the grocery store. We couldn't even call them on a cell phone. So we have got to do something about this. And it goes beyond the schools. It goes into the homes of those families.
Well, to that point, let me bring Leslie in. And Leslie's saying, what is going on in the home? I mean, all of a sudden, you know, we do see children and getting schooled and educated and having interactions with teachers online, but parents are now teachers, and so you know, my question is, what does that seem like, and how, from a PTA perspective, how has that changed your terrain?
Well, it's certainly different in this virtual environment, and every family is having to adapt. And unfortunately, there's probably about 12 million students across our nation that do not have the appropriate technology or device to do their homework at home, or even to really have a virtual reality education. And so that's really affected our families and what we're advocating for. We do feel like funding needs to be really provided. That in some surveys that we've seen, 78% of the people across our country believe technology now is as important as electricity. And so it's a fundamental right for every child to have that access and for the families to be able to do and work with their children. Sorry. And this virus has just become a huge issue, especially for working parents and how to help their children learn appropriately. So it's very different within the family dynamic.
Well, let me ask you both a provocative question, and I want to acknowledge that I think that this is a controversial issue. For years, I've been doing programs on education and have been frustrated that whether it's school funding or how you look at, you know, the zip code issue and difference between, you know, what kids in one part of the country may get in the other. And I've always thought, is there some way, you know, that you could kind of Sal Khan it all, that, you know, somehow there would be a software approach or an online approach where a lot of the unevenness in our educational outcomes in America could be evened out and improved. That doesn't mean you want to cut the teacher out, but is there a way to supplement it? And so I'm wondering, in this time where everyone's been shoved into this digital sandbox, is that an opportunity now to find ways to even it out for students and still have human connectivity with teachers, but to get something where we get past the debate of having good teachers and bad teachers, that there's a lot more surrounding that conveyor of information and education? Lily, tell me where I'm wrong, as Rachel Maddow would say.
I don't think there's anything that takes the place of a caring, competent teacher. What we now know is that that caring, competent teacher needs to know a lot about virtual learning, and that it's not like a class. Like, this is our online learning class. You're the reading teacher, you're the calculus teacher, you're the art teacher. What do you teach? And how are you going to make that in a virtual world come alive even more? Because here's what we know: it was like someone pulled the fire alarm in 100,000 schools, and everybody like raced out of the building. And the next day, people like me, I'm a 6th grade teacher, people like me were told, all right, whatever you were doing with those 35 kids in your classroom, now do it online. And they're sitting in 35 different kitchens all over the town. And we didn't know where to begin. And so we now know that this has to become part and parcel of becoming a teacher, just like you learn how to plan a lesson and you learn what your objectives are. But we also know that if we're in another situation like this, Lord help us, but we better plan for it. And by the way, we're not out of this one. And so a whole lot of districts out there are not going to have any choice but to continue with some kind of online or hybrid virtual learning, because they can't just open their doors and have 35 kids sitting back in that classroom. But what kind of training are you going to be giving parents? And how are you going to make sure that you can deliver something that's quality? It's never going to be the same. So I've kind of given that up, but something that's meaningful, a teaching and learning experience for those kids that you can deliver right inside their homes. And of course, proper use of technology is going to enhance everything that we do. It enhances the work world. It will enhance the education world. But what we're afraid of is someone will kind of check the box and say, well, plenty of kids have this. Not those kids. Yeah, those kids are the ones you should start with. You should lead with equity. Who is more likely not to have access, not to have parents who have an extra laptop, maybe even have homes that won't have an adult in that home because mom and dad have to go to work. They're in the service industry. They can't do their work at home online. How are we going to make it work for the kids that have so little? That's where we have to begin.
Leslie, how would you respond to Lily Garcia in this? I remember in the 1990s when I worked for Senator Jeff Bingaman of New Mexico, we looked at who were his primary constituents and who they were. It was a single Hispanic mom, single head of household mom with 3 children working 2 jobs. And so I often think about that as sort of my go-to point when I think about the economy and who we're trying to reach. And so when you add on top of that COVID crisis, economic crisis, a pandemic, and you look at that stress point. So I just ask you, because not every, there's no one size fits all when it comes to parents. And I'm looking at my colleague Bob Cusack here, and I'm wondering how he does it with his kids. But what kinds of infrastructure do parents need? We have a lot of policy people watching this right now. What do they need to win as opposed to be victims in this experiment?
Well, I think they need to know that the politicians across this nation begin to understand that education is not a political issue, and they need to value their children and the education that they need in order to make this nation successful. And you're right. I mean, there are parents that work 2 jobs, and now all of a sudden they're being told that they have to be a teacher. They did not sign up for that. They didn't go to school for it. And so that's why that connection with teachers is so valuable for every student. And every student wants to be social, wants to be in school, but that's not always going to be the case with this virus. We're seeing it spread and give hotspots where you really shouldn't be in school. And so that's just an added stressor for parents, because now they're not only the parent, they're the teacher. And psychologists say that's really not a good case for every parent to be 24/7, the one person that's telling them what to do, being that loving parent. And parents are getting so stressed, they just can't handle it all. So it's very much us addressing the the mental part of education, what it's doing to our families. We need them to be engaged, but they have to, number one, they have to know that their children are safe. We have to give them the resources for their schools to be successful. And that means even giving teachers the resources that they need and the technology that they need. And we really feel strongly about that being a part of the new package, because 12 million students, that's enormous across this country, that do not have internet access, that don't have the right device. And if they did, they don't have the access. So we've got to figure out a way to get them quickly on board before we fall really behind as a nation.
Let me ask you both in just our last couple of minutes here a question, because today we're also talking about how this new next wave of technology is going to come and be create new possibly transformative platforms. And as I think it through, as I just mentioned to my colleague about Uber and Lyft, I also think that in some ways, those that are connected, and I get that we have divide issues, we've talked about them, but those that are connected are going to have a way to be more nimble. I'm wondering if we need to think about education in ways we've talked about but never really done, which is continuing education, new ways of credentialing, new ways of creating an ever-present thing. Do we need to be introspective and look at our school structures and our attitudes and our roles and rejigger them on this new platform? And are you both ready for that? Lily?
So yes, and no. Yes, we do need to look at education and educating that whole child. We have to do that. Are we ready for it? No. And let me tell you what. There's no silver lining. I'm not a make lemonade out of lemon kind of girl. This is a pandemic and people are dying, and I'm not going to say, but the good stuff, no. But I will tell you, it has torn off the mask of the have access and the have not access. And all of the things that we could see in the public school where some kids have what they need and other kids don't, we now are expanding onto the home, as we've been talking about. But let me tell you some of the other things. People do think about reading, writing, and arithmetic when they're looking at their public school. But what are the uses in technology for the social worker, for the counselor, for the school psychologist, and by the way, for the school nurse? Where I come from, that's like finding a unicorn. But maybe there's a use for technology for the school nurse to actually be connected to that family, be able to do some health screenings and to help those families in ways that we never thought of before. Maybe we can partner with county health officials in this pandemic and have folks actually enter homes. A lot of folks are visiting their doctor with an app over this pandemic. Maybe we can do something like that and have a health app connected to the school. So those schools that don't have a school nurse will still have a health professional that they can count on. There's so many services that we provide for schools and for families. And maybe when this is all over, what will remain is a new infrastructure of connecting home and school, teacher and parent. That's what I think we should be going for.
Well, we won't call it lemonade out of lemons, but that's a fascinating vision you have there. Leslie?
I think it's really, out of every crisis, there comes opportunity, and we have a great opportunity in our nation to do things differently and look at things differently. What we're finding is family engagement is a priority in education with their teachers and administrators. And this virtual reality has made that easier in some aspects for that to happen. But again, it falls back to everybody having the same resources and those to be there. And so that's the first hurdle. But do I think that probably we will never see education the same before? I don't. I don't think you will see our world the same anymore. We've learned in this crisis how to do things differently and to do them better. And so I think there's great things to come for our parents, our students, our educators. There's a whole wide world opening up, and I think we can do much, much better than we have in the past.
This is so fascinating to talk to both of you. I know you're real stakeholders in what's coming next, and you're both trying in times of, what I call it the triple tsunamis hitting the nation. And so very grateful for your very thoughtful discussion. Lily Garcia heads America's largest union, the National Education Association. Thank you so much. And Leslie Boggs, president of the National PTA. You're very cool. Let's do this again sometime. Let's have a PTA meeting. Okay.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
During the coronavirus pandemic, telemedicine has emerged as a much-needed way to further connect patients with their doctors. My next guest, Dr. Judd Hollander, will be here in a moment. But let me talk to Bob. Bob, you're a dad. How old are your kids?
I'm lucky because they're not as young as they used to be.
So they don't need you anymore.
They don't need, and I've talked to parents who have small kids. So ours are basically teenagers, one in community college. It's been more of a mental struggle, and I've been fortunate because my mom used to teach the hearing impaired in New York City for 20 plus years. So I had a parent as well as a teacher. I really struggle to see how parents have two jobs, right? And then they've got to also teach. The teachers are so important, and I do think that the next administration or the next term of Donald Trump, the teachers have to be focused more on, because it's either Leslie or Lily who said this is not going to change. This is a new way of life, and teachers. Another point I wanted to raise that I know Lily raised is access, where some schools have a lot of stuff and access to the internet and others don't. And that's where opportunity in this country begins. And if you don't have that, well, then you don't have as much as an opportunity as the next kid. And that's got to be fixed.
Thank you for that. So we're going to go to our next guest. My next guest is Dr. Judd Hollander. He's the Senior Vice President of Healthcare Delivery Innovation and Associate Dean for Strategic Health Initiatives at Thomas Jefferson University. One of his recent initiatives is called Jeff Connect, a service that connects patients with doctors from their cell phones, tablets, or computers. Welcome, Dr. Hollander. Thanks so much for joining us. I mean, the two big areas that many people kind of refer to right away when we think of a hyper-connected world, the world of 5G, what's going to happen, is the transformative possibilities in health and in education. There may be also in finance and fraud. There are lots of other areas that we'll be dealing with. But health is right at the top of people's list of what they want. And we've had this big change of people engaging in telehealth, telemedicine, having it paid for by Medicare. And I've done a lot of events on this where there's a fear it's going to collapse and back. But why don't you give us your dashboard as you look at this new connectivity and what it can do for us on the health front?
Well, I think it's a really simple concept that people... Hang on, let me just switch microphones. I'm sorry. I'm talking about how simple it is, and I've become difficult to hear. I think it's a really simple concept for us that we do this all the time, and I don't think everybody knows we do this all the time. You FaceTime with your grandkids. You do text messaging with friends. If you're a physician, you are always reaching out to people, and you are always getting people reaching out and taking care of you. So we did this long before COVID. The trick during COVID was taking those people who had been doing this for a while and really scaling it up overnight. In the Philly area, that was mid-March. And then the second trick was taking people that never did it before and convincing them this was a way they could deliver care. For the last 4 or 5 years, when I would go around speaking on this, I had to convince people this was valuable. Unfortunately, or fortunately, there's nothing like a pandemic to make people see the value immediately. And now I think everybody knows that this is a way care will be delivered forever.
Later in today's program, Dr. Hollander, I'm going to be discussing trust and the challenge of trust in this new world with Representative Scott Peters and some other folks. And I'm just wondering, as people have been shoved into this world, what's the level of trust they have? Because it's not instant, right? I mean, is there a wobbliness in the trust factor as you've seen folks come into both health and connectivity?
So I like to speak of three things: trust, communication, and cooperation. And the way trust played out at the beginning is healthcare providers, right, who make their living, in hospitals who make their money by taking care of people, told patients stay home, because at the beginning we didn't know how to manage patients and their exposures to COVID. So unless you were really sick, we were trying to have people stay away, and that's not what we really want to do. So we developed trust.
That sounds cool.
Yeah. So no, let me see.
No, go ahead. You're fine. You're fine.
Okay. All right. So, okay, I'm going to shut off the phone and just do this on the video. So anyway, so we developed trust so that people would be able to stay away. And I think that's an empowering message when you're a health system. And then now that we know enough about COVID and we can bring people back safely, we've communicating that message and we've developed a lot of trust around that. So when we say you can safely come back, they know that we mean it because we told them stay away before. And then cooperation is tricky because we're cooperating between the patients and the providers, but we've learned to also cooperate between man and machine. And the patients have learned to trust the video. And you see, I'm having a couple hiccups even on this, and we see this on TV and we see this on Zoom meetings, but we're able to get done and deliver the important message. So I think it's the trust, the communication, and the cooperation going forward that gives patients confidence they can get care this way.
Well, believe me, the problems you're having, we're having today too. We're not necessarily at the Model T right now. We're somewhere in between. But I have confidence that this is all going to become much more predictable, a lot more stable. And I appreciate you joining with us. Tell us about Jeff Connect.
So Jeff Connect is our brand name, and the simplest way to think about it is it's all of telemedicine. So before I got to Jefferson 5 or 6 years ago, Dr. Robert Rosenwasser had created a neurostroke network where he and his team could reach out to 30 some odd hospitals and take care of stroke patients remotely. And they would be able to see the patient via telemedicine. They would be able to see the CAT scan via telemedicine, and they would be able to deliver expert care to the patients wherever they were. Right now, they actually have a mobile stroke unit, and we have a goal to try and get the clot dissolving drugs into people when they show up at the hospital within an hour of arrival or within a couple hours of symptom onset. Last week, they did that within 15 minutes, or when the ambulance showed up at a patient's curb. So an unbelievable way to deliver care to somebody's house during an acute stroke. That's not the majority of telemedicine. I break down telemedicine in a couple different ways, but one is it the patient who's seeing the doctor, and that's most of the time, or is it a doctor who's being third-partied in to another healthcare provider to help deliver expert care, like the neurostroke network that I spoke about? So Jeff Connect is an app on your phone. If you're in our region, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, or Delaware, or similarly in other regions with other telemedicine providers, you just go on the phone, you download the app, you put in what your medical information is, and in our system, in less than 5 minutes, you're seeing an emergency physician 24/7, 365. You don't need to schedule an appointment. There's docs standing by, and they see you right away. They see you by video. They do what they can do by video, which isn't always everything, but they can take care of about 75 or 80% of things on the video, and then they can coordinate your care and hopefully be able to keep you out of an emergency department and send you to a place where you could get better, more convenient, faster care, should you need in-person care. On the other side of the coin, really important when COVID broke out, was taking care of both COVID patients with chronic medical problems, diabetes, hypertension, all the things normal people get, as well as people that were afraid to come out of their house. And so we geared up, and we had basically the ability to take care of about 2/3 of the patients that previously had in-person appointments scheduled, but now didn't want to come downtown to the doctor. We took care of them by telemedicine, and that was through a scheduled visit program on Jeff Connect. So I think, thinking of it broadly, there's many other things I could talk about, but you could either just get an ER doc round the clock anytime you want, wait less than 5 minutes, or schedule an appointment with your own primary care doc or your own specialist and see them via telemedicine without having to leave your house.
Judd, that's fascinating. We're right near the end of our program, but let me ask you a question. I love the fact that we have you today, and you bring a good practical expertise. We have politicians coming along. Politicians are a little different, But one of the things I've seen from talking to people about diabetes and constant glucose monitors and telemedicine and telehealth is a dramatic change in this time also in, I don't know how to call it, the accuracy of diagnosis has increased in this time with all of the kind of technology that's come on. And that's something many people think, is that maybe visiting that doctor in person wasn't yielding the best and most accurate diagnoses. Now, we can debate that. But I guess my question is, in this world that we've kind of gone into, some insurance companies have begun walking back what they agreed to pay for in telemedicine and telehealth. And I'm wondering if you and your colleagues are feeling that, or you feel like the results have been so robust that you think that the politicians are going to know we can't go back to an era where those new methodologies aren't paid for. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's a really complex question because it's not just the politicians, it's the commercial payers as well.
Right.
So I think the response from CMS and from Medicare and Medicaid, they rapidly paid for it, and now there's legislation pending that looks like it will extend it to the end of 2021. If that legislation passes, this is just going to be the way everybody's getting healthcare between now and then. And nobody will want to walk it back, both the politicians and the patients. So that will move it forward. And I think everybody is generally supportive of it. It's a different world when you get into commercial payers. The commercial payers, many of them had their best quarter ever in terms of profit because there were no in-person visits. There was no elective surgery. And they paid a little bit of money for telemedicine. And now that we're over the peak in some states, they're walking that back. And I just think that is just totally unconscionable. You just made boatloads of money, and now you're dialing back what patients want to save a little money. But the truth of the matter is some of the commercial payers, their responsibility isn't to the patient or the health system, it's to the shareholders. And if you let people have a primary profit motive in healthcare, they're going to do actually what they're unfortunately supposed to do, which is make money. And when you're trying to make money, the less you spend, the more you make. So I am actually afraid the commercial payers are going to walk it back, but I have all the confidence in the world that 6 months or a year from now, they're going to have to move forward again after CMS sets a good example for everybody. It would be much nicer if they honored the fact that patients are paying them a boatload of money each year to get care, and they just paid for that care to be delivered.
Well, with that, Dr. Judd Hollander, Senior Vice President of Healthcare Delivery Innovation. We should keep talking about healthcare delivery innovation. It's a big topic, and I think it's going to continue to evolve at Thomas Jefferson University. Thanks for sharing with us, Jeff Connect, and your views on this important subject today. We really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you for having me. Have a great day. Stay safe.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of our first session. We will be back at 1:30 p.m. for our second session. I'll be speaking with Daphne Kohler, co-founder of Coursera and founder of Incitro, as well as Mike Rogers, the former chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and the current chairman of 5G Action Now. Take a break, grab some lunch. I want to say special thanks again to my colleague Bob Cusack, who's been hanging out with me this morning, and we'll meet you right back here in just a bit.